It was the late 19th century, a moment in American history when money moved faster than tradition could keep up. Railroads stitched the continent together. Steel, oil, and finance created fortunes almost overnight. Old European aristocracy had inherited wealth over centuries. In the United States, wealth was being invented in a single generation, and once it appeared, it demanded to be seen. This was the Gilded Age, an era not defined by subtlety, restraint, or understatement, but by scale. Bigger houses, richer materials, more servants, more land, more spectacle. These were not simply homes, they were declarations, proof that America had arrived, and that its new elite intended to rival and often surpass the grandeur of Europe. Across the country, from the cliffs of Newport to the hills of California, fortunes were translated into stone, marble, and steel. Industrialists, financiers, and heirs commissioned architects trained in Paris, landscapers inspired by Versailles, and artisans imported from across the Atlantic. Every room, every staircase, every garden path was designed to communicate power, permanence, and cultural legitimacy. Yet what makes these mansions truly remarkable is not just how extravagant they once were, but the fact that many of them still stand today. While countless Gilded Age palaces were demolished, abandoned, or stripped of their contents, a select few survived, preserved, restored, opened to the public. They offer a rare opportunity to step directly into the world of America's most ambitious age of wealth. In this documentary, we're taking you inside 20 of the most extraordinary Gilded Age mansions ever built. These are estates you can still visit, walk through, study up close, from legendary summer cottages and vast country palaces to urban strongholds of power and influence. Each one tells a story about ambition, excess, and the desire to leave something behind that could outlast its creator. Some were built at the very height of the Gilded Age, others pushed just beyond it, but all of them capture the same mindset, a belief that wealth should not be hidden, but immortalized in stone. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future deep dives into history, wealth, and the worlds built by those who had the means to shape them. And as we go, let us know in the comments which mansion you would most want to visit, or which one you think best represents the Gilded Age at its peak. Newport, Rhode Island, did not become the summer capital of American wealth by accident. It was chosen deliberately. Long before the Gilded Age reached its peak, Newport had already established itself as a refined coastal retreat, known for sea air, believed to restore health, and for social circles that valued exclusivity. By the mid-19th century, as rail travel made movement effortless for the wealthy, Newport transformed from a quiet resort town into a proving ground for America's richest families. What followed was not simply residential development, it was competition. By the 1,872nd and 1,882nd, industrial fortunes were exploding. Railroads, steel, oil, banking, and manufacturing created wealth on a scale the United States had never seen. These fortunes were new, often made within a single lifetime, and their owners were keenly aware that money alone did not grant legitimacy. Status had to be built, curated, and displayed. Newport became the stage where that transformation took place. Families from New York and Philadelphia began purchasing coastal land and erecting summer cottages, a term that quickly lost all meaning. These were not modest retreats. They were vast estates designed to impress peers and intimidate rivals. Each season raised the stakes. If one family built large, the next built larger. If one imported marble, another imported entire rooms from Europe. Social standing was measured in square footage, guest lists, and architectural pedigree. At the center of this arms race stood the Vanderbilt family. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, grandson of the Commodore, understood Newport's social mechanics perfectly. By the early 1892s, the Vanderbilts already owned multiple properties in the city, but none carried the symbolic weight he desired. He wanted something final, something that would eclipse every neighboring mansion and leave no doubt about where power resided. The result was the Breakers. Constructed between 1893 and 1895, the Breakers was not merely a summer home, it was a statement of dominance. Modeled after Italian Renaissance palaces, the The structure occupied 13 acres overlooking the Atlantic Ocean and contained 48 bedrooms, 27 fireplaces, and interiors designed by the most prestigious artisans of the era. Every surface was intentional. Every room was a lesson in hierarchy, craftsmanship, and expense. The house was designed to function as a social machine. Guests moved through a carefully choreographed sequence of spaces, each more impressive than the last. Public rooms emphasized scale and ornamentation, while private family quarters, though still lavish, retreated into relative restraint. The architecture communicated order, who belonged where, who had access, and who was meant to be impressed. Yet, for all its extravagance, the Breakers was never intended as a year-round residence. Like most Newport estates, it was a seasonal headquarters. The Vanderbilt family arrived in late spring, bringing with them servants, luggage, and social obligations. The summer calendar filled rapidly with dinners, dances, and house parties that often lasted for days. To be invited was to be validated. To be excluded was to be irrelevant. Behind the scenes, the house functioned with military precision. A large domestic staff worked out of sight, maintaining fires, meals, lighting, and cleaning on a constant cycle. The illusion of effortless luxury depended entirely on disciplined labor. Guests rarely saw the machinery of the household, but it was always there, humming beneath the marble floors. The Breakers quickly earned its reputation as the flagship of Newport society. It hosted foreign dignitaries, business magnates, and political figures. Its reputation extended far beyond Rhode Island, reinforcing the idea that America's wealth no longer needed European approval. The house itself became part of the Vanderbilt brand, a physical extension of the family's economic reach. But Newport did not revolve around a single mansion. Just a short distance away stood Marble House, built by William K. Vanderbilt as a birthday gift for his wife Alva. Completed earlier, between 1888 and 1892, Marble House marked a turning point in American domestic architecture. It was among the first true Beaux-Arts residences in the United States, signaling a shift away from eclectic Victorian styles toward classical European forms. As its name suggests, marble dominated the structure. Hundreds of thousands of cubic feet were used in its construction, including white marble imported from Italy and Westchester County. The house was conceived not only as a residence but as a ceremonial object. Its scale, materials, and layout mirrored European palaces, positioning the Vanderbilts as cultural equals to Old World nobility. Alva Vanderbilt understood the social power of architecture, perhaps better than anyone in Newport. After divorcing William Vanderbilt only a few years after the house was completed, she retained Marble House and transformed it into a political and social platform. On its grounds, she hosted gatherings that blended wealth with activism, most notably rallies, advocating for women's suffrage. In doing so, Marble House became something rare among Gilded Age mansions, a site of social change rather than mere display. Another Newport landmark, the Elms, reflected a different expression of wealth. Built in 1901 for coal magnate Edward Julius Berwind, the Elms drew inspiration from 18th-century French chateaux. Its symmetry, gardens, and interior collections emphasized refinement over intimidation. Renaissance ceramics, European paintings, and Asian art filled the rooms, suggesting cultivated taste rather than raw financial power. The Elms required nearly 40 servants to operate during the summer season. Like the Breakers, it was designed for entertaining on a grand scale, but its atmosphere leaned toward elegance rather than spectacle. Even so, its fate revealed how fragile these estates could be. After Berwin's death and subsequent changes in ownership, the house narrowly escaped demolition before preservationists intervened. These stories repeat throughout Newport. Rosecliff, completed between 1898 and 1902, was designed explicitly for entertaining. Built for silver heiress Teresa Fair Ulrichs, it became famous for hosting some of the most elaborate parties of the era. Its ballroom, inspired by Versailles, was engineered to accommodate large crowds, orchestras, and elaborate decorations. The house functioned less as a home and more as a social stage set. Despite its popularity, Rosecliff eventually lost its original furnishings, a reminder that even the grandest houses were vulnerable once fortunes shifted and heirs lost interest. Its survival depended not on private wealth, but on institutional preservation. What Newport demonstrates more clearly than any other place is the contradiction at the heart of the Gilded Age. These mansions were built to project permanence, yet most were financially unsustainable in the long term. They required enormous staffs, constant maintenance, and uninterrupted income. When economic conditions changed, or when families fractured through inheritance and divorce, the houses became liabilities rather than assets. That so many Newport mansions still stand today is not the result of their original owners' foresight. It is the result of later intervention. Preservation societies, public institutions, and cultural organizations stepped in where private wealth withdrew. In doing so, they transformed symbols of private excess into public history. Walking through these houses now, the social context has shifted. Visitors no longer arrive as rivals or guests, but as observers. The rooms still impress, but they also provoke questions. What kind of society produces homes like these? What values are embedded in their walls? And what does it mean that so many similar mansions across America were destroyed once they outlived their usefulness? Newport offers no simple answers. It presents evidence. The scale, the materials, the labor, the ambition, all remain visible. These mansions are not nostalgic fantasies. They are documents. They record a moment when wealth concentrated rapidly, when architecture became a competitive sport, and when America tested the limits of how much private power could be expressed in physical form. As the Gilded Age progressed, this model spread far beyond Rhode Island. Country estates rose along the Hudson River. Palatial homes appeared in California, Florida, and the Midwest. Each borrowed lessons first perfected in Newport. Build big, build fast, build visibly, and hope, somehow, that it would last. For some, it did. For most, it did not. Newport stands today as both monument and warning. A place where ambition achieved its purest architectural form and where the costs of that ambition are impossible to ignore. As the Gilded Age matured, its architectural ambitions began to move beyond seasonal resorts like Newport and into something more permanent, more expansive, and more territorial. Wealth no longer needed a summer stage alone. It demanded estates that could operate year-round, command landscapes, and function as private worlds unto themselves. This shift marked a turning point. Mansions were no longer just social weapons. They became empires. Nowhere is this transformation more clearly visible than in the great country estates of the early 20th century, where land mattered as much as architecture. These properties were measured not only by the number of rooms, but by acreage, agricultural output, and the ability to remain insulated from the outside world. Wealth was no longer content to impress neighbors. It wanted autonomy. In Delaware, Alfred I DuPont embodied this evolution with the creation of Nemours. Built between 1909 and 1910, on a 300-acre plot outside Wilmington, Nemours was conceived as an American interpretation of European aristocratic living. But unlike Newport's seasonal mansions, Nemours was designed to exist as a controlled environment year-round. The house itself contained 77 rooms, filled with European master paintings, tapestries, and furniture acquired with deliberate intent. Nothing was casual, nothing was inherited by chance. DuPont selected objects that reinforced cultural legitimacy, signaling that American wealth could curate taste as skillfully as old European families. Yet Nemours' true power lay outside its walls. Surrounding the mansion were formal French gardens spanning more than 200 acres, modeled after Versailles. These gardens were not decorative accessories. They were statements of control over nature. Every hedge, path, and water feature was engineered to demonstrate order imposed on scale. The message was unmistakable. This estate did not merely sit on land, it commanded it. Unlike Newport's houses, Nemours included extensive support infrastructure. Chauffeur garages housed a growing collection of automobiles, symbolizing the transition from horse-drawn aristocracy to mechanized modern power. Staff housing, maintenance facilities, and service corridors ensured the estate functioned smoothly without visible effort. Wealth had become operational. By the time Nemours was completed, the Gilded Age was technically over, but its mentality had not vanished. It had evolved. On the opposite coast, that evolution reached its most extravagant extreme at Hearst Castle. Perched high above the Pacific Ocean in San Simeon, California, the estate conceived by William Randolph Hearst defied traditional classification. It was not a house. It was not even an estate in the conventional sense. It was an ongoing experiment in scale, accumulation, and personal mythology. Construction began in 1919 and continued for nearly 3 decades. Hearst never considered the project finished. As long as his fortune and health allowed, the castle grew. More rooms, more buildings, more collections. What began as a hilltop retreat expanded into a sprawling compound containing a main castle, 3 guest houses, gardens, terraces, pools, a private airstrip, and what would become the largest private zoo in the world. Hearst's ambition differed from that of earlier Gilded Age builders. While men like Vanderbilt sought legitimacy through classical restraint, Hearst embraced accumulation without apology. He collected relentlessly. European ceilings were dismantled and shipped across the Atlantic. Entire rooms were reconstructed piece by piece. Sculptures, tapestries, and artifacts arrived faster than they could be catalogued. The result was a residence that functioned as both home and museum, though it was neither in the modern sense. Guests wandered through spaces where Renaissance art sat beside Spanish tiles and Roman fragments, unified only by Hearst's authority to acquire them. The social life of Hearst Castle reinforced its mythology. Hollywood elites, politicians, journalists, and foreign dignitaries were invited not simply to visit, but to experience the fantasy of absolute privilege. Days revolved around swimming, tennis, films, and elaborate meals. Evenings blurred into spectacle. Yet beneath the leisure was an unmistakable imbalance. Guests were entertained, but always on Hearst's terms. The castle was designed to overwhelm. Unlike Newport, where social competition defined architecture, Hearst Castle eliminated competition entirely. There was nothing comparable. It existed beyond rivalry. But even this fortress of excess proved vulnerable. As Hearst's health declined and his finances tightened, construction slowed. Eventually, he left the estate altogether. In 1947, the unfinished dream was donated to the state of California. The most ambitious private residence in America became public property. This pattern repeated itself across the country. In Florida, Henry Flagler's Whitehall reflected the southern expansion of Gilded Age ideals. Completed in 1902 as a wedding gift to his third wife, Whitehall served as a winter palace in Palm Beach. Flagler, an oil magnate and railroad developer, understood Florida not merely as a destination, but as a project. His mansions were anchors for development, drawing wealth, tourism, and investment into regions he intended to reshape. Whitehall functioned as both residence and promotional device. Guests arrived not only to enjoy luxury, but to witness the promise of Florida as a new frontier for elite living. The house required only weeks of occupancy each year, yet its influence extended far beyond its walls. After Flagler's death, Whitehall passed through uncertain hands before narrowly escaping demolition. Its survival depended on family intervention and eventual transformation into a museum. Like so many Gilded Age estates, it endured not because of sustained private wealth, but because public interest replaced private necessity. Further west, estates like Filoli in California demonstrated how the Gilded Age aesthetic adapted to regional identity. Completed in 1917 for William Bowers Bourne II, Filoli combined Georgian architecture with vast, landscaped grounds that emphasized serenity over dominance. Its design suggested a shift away from confrontational wealth toward curated retreat. The estate's name itself reflected this philosophy, drawn from a personal credo emphasizing purpose, compassion, and life well lived. Yet despite this softer framing, Filoli remained enormous by any standard. 56 rooms, expansive gardens, orchards, reservoirs, and private infrastructure ensured complete independence from surrounding communities. When the property eventually passed into public hands, it retained its character precisely because it had been designed as a self-contained world. The transition from private to public ownership altered access, but not intent. Across the Hudson Valley, estates like Kikuit reinforced the idea that wealth could anchor itself across generations. Home to 4 generations of the Rockefeller family, Kikuit was not merely inherited, it was curated. Built between 1908 and 1913 atop Pocantico Hills, the mansion overlooked the river like a watchtower of permanence. Unlike many Gilded Age houses, Kikuit emphasized continuity. Its interiors housed carefully assembled collections of modern art, European ceramics, and furniture selected over decades. The estate evolved slowly, reflecting the Rockefellers' long-term view of wealth as stewardship rather than spectacle. Yet even here, public access eventually replaced private exclusivity. The estate survives today not as a family residence, but as a preserved artifact administered by historical organizations. What emerges from these examples is a clear pattern. As Gilded Age wealth matured, it sought scale, isolation, and control. But it could not outrun time. No matter how large the estate, no matter how vast the fortune, maintenance eventually exceeded private interest. These houses were built to last forever. Few were designed to survive without their creators. When fortunes fractured, heirs dispersed, and economic priorities shifted, the estates faced extinction. Some were demolished, others stripped and abandoned. A select few were saved, not by wealth, but by history. Today, walking through these estates reveals more than luxury. It exposes systems, labor hierarchies, social engineering, architectural psychology. These were not accidental byproducts. They were intentional designs meant to shape behavior, impress observers, and reinforce power. The Gilded Age mansion was never just a home, it was a machine, and like all machines, once its purpose ended, it either adapted or disappeared. The ones that remain stand not as celebrations, but as evidence. As the Gilded Age pushed forward into the early 20th century, the geography of American wealth began to change. The obsession with coastal retreats and isolated country estates did not disappear, but it was joined by a new ambition: permanence within the American landscape itself. These mansions were no longer experiments or seasonal indulgences. They were intended as dynastic anchors, built to house generations, preserve family identity, and project continuity in a nation defined by constant change. This shift is most clearly visible in the great estates of the Hudson Valley and Long Island's Gold Coast, where proximity to New York City combined with sweeping landholdings to create a new aristocratic corridor. Here, wealth was not escaping society. It was positioning itself just close enough to control it. Hyde Park, the Vanderbilt mansion built by Frederick William Vanderbilt, exemplified this mindset. Constructed between 1896 and 1899, the estate was not conceived as a flamboyant social weapon like Newport's summer houses. Instead, it was designed as a country palace, a place of refinement, stability, and inherited authority. Its classical architecture communicated restraint, but restraint at scale. The interiors reinforced this message. Exotic wood paneling, imported marbles, French tapestries, and salvaged European architectural elements filled the 54-room mansion. These were not decorative flourishes chosen for novelty. They were symbols of lineage. By embedding fragments of old European houses into a new American estate, the Vanderbilts were asserting cultural inheritance rather than raw wealth. Hyde Park also revealed another emerging truth of the era. Legacy required planning beyond one's lifetime. When Frederick Vanderbilt died in 1938, the estate passed not through generations of heirs, but directly into public stewardship. Transferred to the federal government, it became a national museum. The transition was smooth, precisely because the house had been built to endure without constant reinvention. A similar logic guided the Rockefellers at Kykwit. Unlike many Gilded Age families whose fortunes fractured under inheritance disputes, the Rockefellers approached wealth as an institution. Kykwit, constructed between 1908 and 1913, was less a monument to individual ambition than a headquarters for dynastic continuity. It housed 4 generations, each shaping the estate incrementally rather than radically. The mansion's placement atop Pocantico Hills was symbolic. From its terraces, the Hudson River stretched outward, a reminder of commerce, movement, and power. Yet the house itself resisted ostentation. Its classical Georgian design emphasized balance and proportion. Inside, the emphasis shifted from architectural spectacle to intellectual and artistic curation. Kykwit's art collection reflected a modern sensibility. Works by Picasso, Monet, Matisse, Chagall, and Warhol shared space with Asian ceramics and European furnishings. This was not nostalgia for old Europe. It was an assertion that American wealth could shape contemporary culture, not merely imitate the past. Still, even the most disciplined dynastic planning could not insulate these estates from social change. By the mid-20th century, maintaining such properties as private residences became increasingly impractical. Staff shortages, rising taxes, and shifting public attitudes toward concentrated wealth eroded the foundations that had once supported them. On Long Island's North Shore, this reckoning arrived with particular force. The Gold Coast, immortalized in fiction as a playground of excess, was once lined with colossal mansions rivaling those of Europe. Investment bankers, industrialists, and heirs built palaces designed to rival Versailles in scale, if not in age. Oheka Castle stood among the most ambitious of these projects. Completed between 1914 and 1919, for financier Otto Hermann Kahn, the chateau-style estate stretched across 127 rooms and over 100,000 square feet. Built on the highest point of Long Island, it was visible for miles. Its very placement was an announcement. Oheka functioned as both residence and theater. Lavish parties, musical performances, and social gatherings reinforced Kahn's role as cultural patron as much as financial power broker. Yet within decades, the estate's original purpose collapsed. Changing economic conditions and evolving lifestyles rendered such scale obsolete. By the time Oheka was revived as a hotel and event venue later in the 20th century, its survival depended entirely on reinvention. Luxury no longer meant private ownership, it meant curated access. Elsewhere on Long Island, Old Westbury Gardens illustrated a softer version of this transition. Built in 1906 as a wedding gift for Margaret Phipps, the estate combined English country house aesthetics with expansive formal gardens. Its scale was substantial but controlled. The house did not dominate the land so much as frame it. When Old Westbury transitioned into a museum, it did so with relative ease. Its gardens, paths, and interior spaces adapted naturally to public exploration. The estate had been designed not just to impress guests, but to be walked, studied, and experienced. That foresight ensured its relevance long after private ownership faded. These estates reveal an uncomfortable truth about the Gilded Age. The houses that survived were not always the grandest. They were the most adaptable. In contrast, many properties that emphasized spectacle over function vanished entirely, demolished, subdivided, forgotten. Their land proved more valuable than their walls. Their names linger only in photographs and footnotes. This pattern repeated across the country. In California, Filoli's survival owed much to its landscape. Its 16 acres of formal gardens, orchards, and natural features created a destination rather than a relic. Visitors did not simply tour a house, they inhabited an environment. That experiential quality allowed the estate to remain culturally relevant, even as its original owners disappeared from public memory. Similarly, Sands Point Preserve on Long Island transformed excess into multiplicity. By encompassing 3 distinct mansions within a single public park, it reframed private indulgence as shared heritage. Education programs, exhibitions, and cultural events replaced exclusive social calendars. The estate's survival came not from freezing time, but from broadening purpose. Perhaps the clearest example of legacy redefined is Clayton, the Frick family residence in Pittsburgh. Originally a modest house purchased shortly after Henry Clay Frick's marriage, Clayton expanded as Frick's fortune grew. What began as an 11-room home evolved into a 23-room mansion, reflecting Gilded Age sensibilities. Yet unlike later Frick residences in New York, Clayton retained a sense of domestic intimacy. When Frick's daughter, Helen Clay Frick, inherited the property, she made a decisive choice. Rather than allow the estate to decay or be absorbed into private development, she transformed it into a public institution. Upon her death in 1984, Clayton became a museum, joined by art collections, gardens, and cultural spaces. In doing so, Clayton escaped the fate of many similar houses. It did not attempt to preserve the illusion of private wealth. It acknowledged history and invited the public inside. What unites these surviving estates is not architectural style or geographic location, it is transition. Each one crossed a threshold from private power to public memory. The moment that transition occurred varied, but the outcome was consistent. Without adaptation, extinction was inevitable. The Gilded Age mansion was never designed for democracy. Its corridors enforced hierarchy. Its service systems reinforced invisibility. Its scale separated owner from environment. Yet today, these same spaces are navigated freely by visitors. The meaning of the architecture has changed, even if the walls remain the same. Walking through these houses now, the silence is striking. Not because they are empty, but because the noise of ambition has faded. What remains is evidence of how wealth once behaved, how it sought validation, how it attempted to outlast time. These mansions were built as answers to rivals, to critics, to insecurity. They were declarations carved into stone. In the end, history answered back, and it did not preserve everything. By the time the Gilded Age reached its final decades, the illusion of endless expansion had begun to fracture. The mansions still rose, the parties still glittered, the fortunes still appeared vast. But beneath the marble floors and gilded ceilings, the economic and social conditions that made such extravagance possible were quietly changing. What had once seemed permanent was becoming precarious. The houses built during this period reveal that tension clearly. Many of the most ambitious estates were completed just as the foundations of the Gilded Age began to erode. They stand today not only as monuments to wealth, but as records of a moment when confidence outran sustainability. Nowhere is this contradiction more visible than in America's largest private homes. Biltmore Estate, completed in 1895 for George Washington Vanderbilt, was conceived at the height of Gilded Age optimism. Unlike most estates of its time, Biltmore was designed not merely as a residence, but as a fully integrated system. Vanderbilt admired European estates not for their ornamentation, but for their longevity. He believed wealth carried responsibility not in a philanthropic sense, but in an operational one. Biltmore's forests were managed scientifically. Its farms were productive, its infrastructure was built on site. Electricity, heating, water systems, refrigeration, and food production were all integrated into a single framework. The house itself, enormous by any standard, was designed to function daily, not merely impress on special occasions. In theory, Biltmore represented the future of American aristocracy, a self-sustaining estate capable of surviving economic shocks and social change. In reality, even this level of foresight could not fully protect it. When George Vanderbilt died in 1914, the estate faced its first true test. Maintenance costs were immense, staffing requirements were constant. The economic disruptions of World War I and the changing social climate placed enormous pressure on the Vanderbilt family. Biltmore survived not because it was immune to these forces, but because it adapted earlier than most. Other estates were less fortunate. Across the country, mansions built just before the First World War entered a hostile economic environment almost immediately. Taxes increased, domestic labor became harder to secure. Social attitudes toward conspicuous wealth shifted dramatically. What had once been admired now attracted criticism. The sheer scale of these houses became a liability. Carson Mansion in Eureka, California, illustrates this shift from admiration to isolation. Built between 1884 and 1886 by lumber baron William Carson, the house was celebrated as the grandest Victorian residence in America. Its Queen Anne architecture was bold, eclectic, and unapologetically decorative. Every turret, gable, and carved detail announced success. But unlike East Coast estates clustered among peers, Carson Mansion stood apart geographically and socially. When ownership passed out of the Carson family in the mid-20th century, its future depended not on heirs, but on local community leaders. Its survival as a private club rather than a public museum reflects how narrowly it escaped demolition. The fact that such an iconic house remains closed to the public underscores a broader truth. Preservation was never guaranteed. Survival often came down to circumstance rather than intent. Elsewhere, estates adapted by redefining purpose. On Long Island's Gold Coast, Sands Point Preserve transformed concentration into scale. Instead of preserving a single mansion as a static relic, the estate incorporated multiple structures into a public park. The former Guggenheim property, later owned by Howard Gould, became a shared landscape rather than a private domain. This transition required compromise. Formal rooms once designed to impress select guests became exhibition spaces. Lawns once manicured for private leisure hosted public events. The social meaning of the architecture shifted completely, yet that shift ensured survival. The same pattern can be seen at Filoli in California. When the estate passed from private ownership to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, its future depended on accessibility. The mansion alone could not justify preservation. The gardens, orchards, trails, and broader landscape became central to its identity. Visitors today do not simply tour rooms. They spend entire days inhabiting the grounds. The estate survives not as a symbol of wealth, but as an experience. This transformation highlights a critical lesson of the Gilded Age. These houses were built to dominate a social world that no longer exists. To remain relevant, they had to surrender exclusivity. Some estates attempted to resist this reality. Oheka Castle, with its chateau-inspired scale and commanding position atop Long Island, struggled for decades to find purpose after private ownership ended. Its survival required commercial reinvention. As a hotel, event venue, and filming location, it continues to operate but only by abandoning its original role as a family residence. The shift from private palace to commercial luxury reflects a broader trend. Where public ownership was not feasible, market adaptation became the only option. Even then, survival was uncertain. Many estates vanished entirely during the mid-20th century. Demolition was often framed as progress. Large houses were seen as outdated, inefficient, and socially irrelevant. Land was subdivided. Materials were salvaged. Names disappeared from maps. The scale of loss is difficult to overstate. For every mansion preserved, dozens were destroyed. Fifth Avenue in New York once rivaled European boulevards in architectural grandeur. By the 1952, most of its private palaces had been replaced by office towers and apartment buildings. The same occurred in cities across the country. The Gilded Age mansion proved incompatible with modern urban economics. Those that survived did so because they occupied liminal spaces, outside city centers, on protected land, or under the care of institutions capable of absorbing their costs. Even then, preservation required reinterpretation. The Lockwood Matthews Mansion in Connecticut, completed in 1868, illustrates how early Gilded Age architecture became educational material rather than living space. Built just before the era officially began, the house influenced countless later estates, yet its survival depended on municipal ownership and conversion into a museum. Its stenciled walls, rotunda, and Second Empire styling are no longer aspirational models. They are teaching tools. Visitors walk through not to imagine owning such a house, but to understand the mindset that produced it. This shift in perception marks the true end of the Gilded Age. The era did not conclude because wealth disappeared. It ended because its architectural language lost authority. What once symbolized success began to represent excess, inefficiency, and social imbalance. Yet, despite this reversal, fascination persists. People continue to tour these houses, not out of envy, but curiosity. They want to see how wealth once behaved when it believed itself untouchable. They want to understand how architecture was used to enforce hierarchy, ritual, and identity. In this sense, preserved Gilded Age mansions function as cultural evidence rather than celebration. They reveal the labor systems that sustained them. Servant staircases hidden from view, kitchens designed for output rather than comfort, corridors engineered to keep certain people invisible. These were not accidents. They were features. The grandeur of the public rooms depended entirely on the erasure of labor behind them. Today, visitors move freely through spaces once restricted by class. That inversion changes the meaning of the architecture. The walls remain. The intent does not. The Gilded Age mansion was designed to outlast its owner. Few succeeded. Those that did survived not because of wealth, but because society chose to remember them. And memory, unlike fortune, is selective. What remains is a fragmented record of ambition preserved in stone, surrounded by absence, and forever shaped by the world that replaced it. By the early 20th century, the Gilded Age mansion had reached a point of saturation. The formula was known: vast acreage, European architectural references, imported materials, invisible labor. Social performance staged through space. What followed was not innovation, but escalation. Bigger rooms, longer driveways, more elaborate gardens, more isolation. Yet the more these houses grew, the more fragile their future became. The problem was not taste. It was scale colliding with reality. These estates had been designed for a narrow window of history, when private wealth could sustain armies of servants, absorb punitive maintenance costs, and exist largely unchecked by public scrutiny. As the 20th century advanced, that window closed. Industrial capitalism matured, Government expanded. Labor markets changed. Cultural attitudes hardened. The mansion, once a symbol of inevitability, became a liability. This is where the Gilded Age finally reveals its limits. The architecture had promised permanence, but permanence required succession. And succession proved unreliable. Many of the men who built these estates were singular figures. Their wealth was concentrated, their authority unquestioned. But when that authority passed to heirs, it often fractured. Multiple children, competing priorities, inherited obligations without inherited obsession. The mansion that once embodied ambition became a burden shared among people who had not chosen it. In some families, heirs attempted to maintain the illusion. Houses were kept open seasonally, staff was reduced, rooms were closed off to save costs, but the economics were unforgiving. Even reduced operation required immense resources. Deferred maintenance compounded quietly, year after year. Other families surrendered sooner. Furniture was sold. Art collections dispersed. Wings were sealed. Eventually, the land itself became the most valuable asset. Developers circled. Zoning laws shifted. The house stood in the way. Demolition was rarely framed as loss. It was framed as inevitability. This was especially true in urban and suburban settings, where land values rose faster than nostalgia could defend. Fifth Avenue's palaces fell not because they lacked beauty, but because their footprint no longer aligned with profit. What had once been elite neighborhoods became commercial arteries. The mansion, built to dominate its surroundings, was suddenly out of place. Outside cities, the threat was different but just as severe. Country estates depended on isolation, yet isolation made them vulnerable. When transportation patterns changed, when rail lines declined, or roads bypassed former hubs, estates became difficult to access. Tourism was not yet a viable preservation strategy. Without visitors, without revenue, the house decayed quietly. Some estates survived by accident. Remote locations delayed development pressure. Wealthy local patrons intervened. Historical societies formed just in time. These rescues often occurred decades after the mansion's social relevance had ended. By then, the house was no longer threatening. It had become safe to preserve. This timing matters. Gilded Age mansions were not saved at their peak. They were saved after they had lost power. Once stripped of influence, they could be reinterpreted. Their excess could be studied rather than envied. Their hierarchies could be exposed without discomfort. Preservation became possible only after dominance faded. As these houses transitioned into museums, parks, and cultural institutions, a subtle but profound transformation occurred. The narrative shifted from ownership to observation. Visitors no longer arrived as guests hoping to impress hosts. They arrived as witnesses. They followed guided paths. Read interpretive panels. Learned about servant systems, gender roles, and labor divisions that had once been concealed. Spaces designed to enforce silence now encouraged explanation. The architecture did not change. Its meaning did. Ballrooms once used for exclusive events became echo chambers of history. Dining rooms that once enforced seating hierarchies became discussion spaces. Bedrooms once occupied briefly each year became frozen moments, stripped of intimacy. The mansion became an artifact. This shift exposes something essential about the Gilded Age. These houses were never meant to be timeless. They were meant to be timely. They responded to specific anxieties: legitimacy, rivalry, visibility, permanence. When those anxieties faded, the architecture lost its function. Yet fascination endured. Why? Because the Gilded Age mansion compresses multiple truths into a single structure. It reveals how wealth thinks when unconstrained, how it organizes space to control perception, how it hides labor while glorifying leisure, how it equates scale with significance. Walking through these houses today is unsettling precisely because they work. The proportions still impress, the materials still command attention, the logic of dominance remains legible. The discomfort comes from recognizing how effective the design still is, even when stripped of its original context. The mansion does not argue, it asserts. At the same time, absence speaks just as loudly. Empty servant quarters, closed corridors, missing wings demolished decades ago, landscapes reduced from thousands of acres to carefully curated fragments. Preservation is always partial. What survives is selected. What disappears shapes interpretation just as much as what remains. This selective survival distorts memory. The mansions we see today represent a tiny fraction of what once existed. They skew toward the most adaptable, the most photogenic, the most institutionally useful. Entire categories of Gilded Age architecture vanished without trace. Modest estates, transitional houses, experimentation that failed. As a result, the surviving mansions appear more unified than the era truly was. They suggest coherence where there was competition, stability where there was volatility. Understanding the Gilded Age requires reading these houses critically. They are not just products of wealth, they are tools of persuasion. Every staircase, every sightline, every separation between public and private was designed to produce an emotional response. Awe, deference, aspiration, silence. Even today, visitors lower their voices instinctively. The architecture still dictates behavior. This lingering power complicates preservation. How do you present a house built to intimidate without reinforcing its message? How do you interpret excess without glamorizing it? How do you honor craftsmanship without celebrating inequality? There are no simple answers. Some institutions focus on technical achievement, architecture, engineering, art history. Others foreground social context, labor, gender, class, race. Each approach reveals something different. None are complete on their own. What remains clear is that the Gilded Age mansion cannot be neutral. It demands interpretation. As time moves further from the era itself, the risk is not that these houses will disappear. It is that they will be misunderstood, reduced to aesthetic backdrops. Wedding venues, filming locations stripped of context, their beauty becomes content, their history becomes optional. This is the final vulnerability of the Gilded Age mansion. Not collapse, but flattening. When excess becomes aesthetic without explanation, the lessons fade. The architecture becomes spectacle again, divorced from consequence. The very process that once built these houses separating display from reality repeats itself in preservation. Avoiding that outcome requires discipline, context, friction, because these mansions are not fantasies. They are evidence. They record a moment when private wealth believed it could replace institutions, when architecture was used to declare permanence in a society still inventing itself, when confidence eclipsed caution. They survived not because that belief was correct, but because later generations chose to examine it rather than erase it. The Gilded Age did not end with a single crash or reform. It ended slowly, unevenly, and differently in every place these houses stood. What remains are the structures heavy, beautiful, compromised, waiting to be read honestly, not as dreams, but as documents. As the 20th century advanced, the world that had produced the Gilded Age mansion no longer recognized it. The economic logic had shifted. Social values hardened. What once symbolized success now raised questions. Wealth itself did not vanish, but the way it chose to express power changed fundamentally. The mansion, once the ultimate declaration, became an anachronism. This transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded quietly, through maintenance bills, inheritance disputes, tax reforms, labor shortages, and cultural unease. The houses still stood, but the confidence that built them was gone. One of the clearest signals of this shift was the disappearance of live-in domestic labor. Gilded Age estates depended on an invisible workforce that operated around the clock. Servants were not optional. They were structural. Kitchens, corridors, staircases, and entire wings were designed around the assumption that dozens of people would remain unseen yet constantly available. By the 1,920 seconds and 1,930 seconds, that assumption collapsed. Domestic service lost its appeal as industrial and clerical jobs offered better pay, more freedom, and fewer social constraints. Immigration patterns changed. Labor protections expanded. The idea that a household could command 40 or 50 full-time servants became unrealistic. Without staff, the mansion could not function as intended. Heating systems went unused. Fireplaces stayed cold. Rooms were closed off. Entire floors became decorative shells rather than lived spaces. The architecture did not adapt easily. These houses had not been designed for partial use. They were all or nothing. At the same time, taxation reshaped ownership. Property taxes, inheritance taxes, and maintenance costs placed enormous pressure on estates that generated no income. Unlike factories or railroads, mansions did not produce value. They consumed it. For heirs, this created a dilemma. Sell and divide the land, or hold onto a symbol that steadily drained resources. Emotional attachment competed with financial reality. In many cases, reality won. The Great Depression accelerated this reckoning. As markets collapsed and fortunes shrank, the moral climate hardened against visible excess. Mansions that had once been admired now appeared provocative. Keeping them intact seemed irresponsible, even offensive. Selling art collections and furnishings became common. What had taken decades to assemble vanished in a single auction. The house itself often followed. Demolition was framed as modernization. Clearing land for apartments, institutions, or commercial use was justified as progress. The mansion, once seen as a beacon of aspiration, became an obstacle to efficiency. This moment marked a profound reversal. During the Gilded Age, architecture had been used to legitimize wealth. By the mid-20th century, wealth sought legitimacy by distancing itself from architecture. Discretion replaced display. Privacy replaced spectacle. Influence moved into corporations, foundations, and policy rather than stone facades. The modern wealthy still lived well, but they lived differently. Large homes did not disappear entirely, but they shifted in form. New estates emphasized comfort over ceremony, function over intimidation. Staff numbers shrank, floor plans simplified. The logic of dominance softened into the language of lifestyle. The Gilded Age mansion, by contrast, remained frozen in a confrontational posture. It could not soften without losing coherence. This rigidity explains why so many surviving estates exist only as institutions. Museums, preserves, trusts, and foundations stepped into a role private wealth could no longer fulfill. But institutional ownership changed the meaning of the house. Decisions were no longer emotional or personal. They were administrative. Budgets replaced taste. Safety codes replaced social ritual. Rooms that once enforced hierarchy now required signage. Pathways that once excluded now needed accessibility. The mansion was forced to negotiate with the public in ways its builders never anticipated. This negotiation reshaped interpretation. Early preservation efforts often romanticized the era. Tours focused on luxury, craftsmanship, and famous names. Servants were mentioned only in passing. Labor systems were acknowledged but rarely examined. The mansion remained glamorous, if no longer exclusive. Over time, this approach began to shift. Scholars, curators, and visitors asked harder questions. Who built these houses? Who maintained them? Who was excluded from their spaces? Why were certain histories emphasized while others remained invisible? As these questions entered public consciousness, interpretation evolved. Servant quarters were opened, back staircases were highlighted, kitchens, laundries, and service corridors became central to the story rather than peripheral. The mansion was reframed as a workplace as much as a residence. This reframing unsettled the original narrative. The grandeur did not disappear, but it became contextualized. Awe was tempered by awareness. The architecture was no longer allowed to speak alone. Still, tension remained. Even with careful interpretation, these houses exert power. Their scale dwarfs explanation. Their materials demand attention. Visitors respond emotionally before intellectually. The experience is visceral. Interpretation follows afterward. This imbalance creates risk. Without sustained context, the mansion can revert to spectacle. Photography isolates beauty. Social media flattens complexity. The house becomes content rather than evidence. This modern consumption mirrors the original function more closely than most realize. During the Gilded Age, these houses were designed to be consumed visually. Guests were meant to move through them, absorbing messages of scale, refinement, and authority. Today's visitors do the same, though with different intentions. The architecture remains effective. This effectiveness raises uncomfortable questions about continuity. How much has really changed? Has society rejected excess or merely repackaged it? Are these mansions relics of a dead ideology, or early versions of a pattern that continues in new forms? The answers are not simple. What is clear is that the Gilded Age mansion did not fail because it was misunderstood. It failed because it was too explicit. It made power visible in ways later generations found difficult to justify. Modern wealth learned from this mistake. It became quieter, more abstract, less architectural. Power moved behind glass towers, investment portfolios, and digital systems rather than limestone facades. In this sense, The mansion represents a stage of capitalism that was still learning how to hide itself. That is why these houses remain so compelling. They show the machinery openly. They do not disguise hierarchy. They do not apologize for scale. They declare, and because they declare, they invite scrutiny. Standing inside these spaces today creates a double awareness. One sees both the ambition that built them and the fragility that followed. The walls appear solid, but their history is unstable. Ownership changed, meaning shifted, purpose dissolved. What survived was not intention, but structure. These houses outlived their creators, but not their context. They exist in a kind of historical suspension, preserved but dislocated, too heavy to remove, too charged to ignore. The Gilded Age mansion, at its core, was an attempt to make wealth permanent, to fix it in place, to give it mass and memory. History refused the offer. What remains are shells filled with interpretation, standing as reminders that power can build almost anything except permanence. As time continued to widen the distance between the Gilded Age and the present, these mansions entered a final, uneasy phase of existence. They were no longer residences. They were no longer symbols of living power, yet they were also not ruins. Instead, they occupied an in-between state, preserved, curated, maintained, but fundamentally disconnected from the social systems that created them. This state of suspension defines their modern identity. Unlike ancient palaces, whose builders are separated from us by centuries and myth, Gilded Age mansions remain uncomfortably close. The names attached to them still circulate. The corporations endure. The fortunes, though redistributed, still echo through modern finance, philanthropy, and influence. The houses are reminders not of a distant civilization, but of a familiar one. This proximity complicates interpretation. Visitors do not approach these mansions as they would medieval castles or Roman ruins. There is no sense of total rupture. Instead, there is recognition. The materials feel modern, the layouts feel readable, the comforts feel transferable. One can imagine living there, and that imagination blurs critical distance. That imaginative accessibility is part of the danger. The Gilded Age mansion invites fantasy. It tempts visitors to picture themselves ascending the grand staircases, hosting the dinners, occupying the master suites. The architecture encourages identification rather than analysis. Without intervention, the house becomes aspirational again, repeating its original function. This is why context matters so intensely. Preservation institutions have increasingly recognized that these houses cannot be presented neutrally. Neutrality favors the architecture. It allows scale, craftsmanship, and beauty to dominate interpretation. The result is admiration without interrogation. To counter this, many sites now emphasize systems rather than spectacle. They explain how food arrived at the table, how laundry was processed, how servants slept, how heat moved through walls, how hierarchy was enforced spatially. These details reframe the mansion not as fantasy, but as infrastructure. Seen this way, the house becomes less mysterious and more mechanical. This shift reveals another truth about the Gilded Age. The mansion was not an indulgence detached from industry. It was industry's product. Every chandelier represented labor extraction. Every imported marble slab reflected global trade networks. Every garden reflected land control. The house was capitalism made visible. Understanding this removes the illusion of isolation. These estates were not private worlds. They were nodes in vast economic systems. Railroads delivered materials. Factories generated wealth. Ports moved goods. Labor markets supplied servants. The mansion sat at the end of a long chain of exploitation and coordination. When that chain weakened, the house faltered. Modern visitors often focus on the emotional narratives: family drama, scandal, romance, tragedy. While compelling, these stories can obscure the larger picture. The mansion's fate was rarely decided by sentiment alone. It was decided by economics. Even families that loved their estates could not always keep them. This reality challenges the idea that preservation is a natural outcome of appreciation. Many of the most beloved houses survived not because families wanted them to, but because institutions intervened when private ownership failed. Preservation is reactive, not organic. This distinction matters. It means survival is not evidence of success. It is evidence of salvage. The houses we see today are those that could be repurposed, those that aligned with tourism, those that fit educational narratives, Those that occupied land deemed worth saving. Others equally grand, equally significant, disappeared without ceremony. The Gilded Age mansion is therefore an incomplete archive. It shows us what remained, not what mattered most at the time. This incompleteness should temper nostalgia. For every preserved ballroom, dozens were bulldozed. For every intact dining room, countless libraries, galleries, and salons were stripped and sold. The surviving houses create a false sense of abundance. In reality, they represent a narrow slice of a vanished landscape. Understanding this absence is essential. It reminds us that power is not self-preserving. It must be continuously reinforced, defended, and adapted. The Gilded Age elite believed their wealth could solidify into permanence through architecture. History proved otherwise. Yet the impulse behind that belief has not disappeared. Modern wealth still seeks visibility. It still seeks insulation. It still seeks architectural expression, though often in subtler forms. Gated communities, private compounds, luxury towers, and exclusive enclaves repeat familiar patterns with updated aesthetics. The difference lies in messaging. Where the Gilded Age mansion declared dominance openly, modern wealth prefers discretion. Glass replaces stone. Minimalism replaces ornament. Privacy replaces performance. But the underlying goal remains control. Seen through this lens, Gilded Age mansions are not aberrations. They are early drafts. They represent a moment when wealth had not yet learned to camouflage itself. When power spoke loudly because it believed it could, this makes them uniquely valuable historical tools. They allow us to examine ambition before it learned restraint, hierarchy before it learned subtlety, inequality before it learned justification. They are blunt objects in a world that now favors abstraction. Standing inside one today produces a strange cognitive dissonance. The space is undeniably beautiful. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The scale is intoxicating. And yet the system that created it feels indefensible. This tension is the mansion's true legacy. It forces confrontation rather than comfort. It asks visitors to reconcile admiration with critique, to hold two truths simultaneously: that human creativity produced these spaces, and that human systems made them possible at enormous cost. Few historical artifacts create this level of friction. That friction is precisely why these houses still matter. They resist easy categorization. They cannot be dismissed as relics of ignorance, nor celebrated as pure achievement. They exist in the gray space where progress and exploitation overlap. As educational tools, they offer something rare: experiential complexity. One does not simply read about inequality. One walks through it. One sees how space organizes behavior, how architecture enforces silence, how beauty can distract from imbalance. These lessons are not abstract. They are spatial, physical, immediate. This immediacy explains why the Gilded Age continues to fascinate. Not because it was glamorous, but because it was revealing. It exposed the mechanics of wealth before those mechanics learned to disappear. The mansions are the evidence left behind. They remind us that permanence is an illusion, but expression is not. What we build reflects what we believe, even if those beliefs do not survive us. In the end, the Gilded Age mansion did not fail because it was excessive. It failed because it was honest. It told the truth about power too clearly. And history, uncomfortable with that clarity, chose not to repeat it, only to rephrase it. What stands today are the remaining sentences in that unfinished argument, written in stone, waiting for each generation to decide how to read them. As the distance between the Gilded Age and the modern world continues to grow, something unexpected has happened. These mansions, once symbols of unchecked power, have become sites of reflection. They no longer function as declarations of dominance, but as mirrors reflecting how societies understand wealth, labor, and legacy, long after the money that built them has dispersed. This transformation did not occur because attitudes softened. It occurred because time stripped the houses of their original authority. When these estates were first constructed, their meaning was immediate and unambiguous. Size equaled status. Materials equaled legitimacy. Visibility equaled power. The mansion worked because everyone understood the language it spoke. Guests, servants, rivals, and the public all read the same message: this family mattered. Today, that shared understanding no longer exists. Visitors arrive without social obligation. They do not seek approval. They are not evaluated by hosts. They walk freely through spaces once governed by rigid protocol. The architecture still asserts itself, but the audience has changed, and with it, the interpretation. This shift reveals a deeper truth about the Gilded Age mansion. Its power was never inherent. It was relational. It depended on recognition. Once recognition disappeared, the mansion became vulnerable, not physically, but symbolically. This vulnerability explains why these houses now feel strangely quiet, even when crowded. The sound of ambition is gone. The urgency has faded. What remains is structure without momentum. That absence is instructive. It shows that power, when expressed solely through material form, has a limited lifespan. Without continuous reinforcement, social, economic, cultural, it becomes static. The Gilded Age mansion froze wealth at a single moment. History moved on. Modern institutions that steward these estates must grapple with this dissonance daily. They are responsible not only for preserving buildings, but for translating meaning. That task is far more complex than restoration. Restoration deals with surfaces. Interpretation deals with systems. Every decision, what rooms to highlight, what stories to tell, what details to foreground, shapes how the public understands the era. Emphasize luxury alone, and the mansion becomes aspirational again. Emphasize labor alone, and the architecture risks being reduced to a moral exhibit. The challenge lies in holding both realities together. The Gilded Age mansion was a masterpiece of coordination. Architects, artisans, engineers, and laborers produced extraordinary results. At the same time, those results were made possible by extreme inequality, exploitative labor practices, and concentration of power. Both facts are true. Ignoring either distorts history. This tension explains why these houses provoke such strong reactions. Some visitors feel awe, others feel discomfort, many feel both at once. That emotional conflict is not accidental. It is the residue of the mansion's original purpose. These spaces were designed to produce emotional response. Long corridors, slow movement, grand staircases elevate bodies physically and symbolically. High ceilings diminish the individual. Ornament overwhelms the senses. These techniques remain effective even without context. Modern architecture often avoids such overt manipulation. It favors neutrality, openness, and ambiguity. The Gilded Age mansion does the opposite. It declares intention, it directs experience. That directness feels foreign today. And yet, it remains compelling. This is why Gilded Age mansions continue to appear in film, television, and visual culture. They communicate wealth instantly. No explanation is required. A single shot establishes hierarchy, power, and scale. These houses have become visual shorthand, but shorthand strips nuance. When a mansion becomes a backdrop rather than a subject, its history collapses into aesthetic. The house is consumed as image, not evidence. Its complexity dissolves into mood. This flattening mirrors the original logic of the Gilded Age itself. Display first, meaning later, if at all. In this sense, modern media risks reenacting the very system these houses once served. The difference is awareness. We now know how the story ends. We know the fortunes fractured. We know the houses emptied. We know the illusion of permanence failed. That knowledge changes how we should read the architecture. But knowledge alone is not enough. It must be activated. Preserved mansions offer a rare opportunity to examine how inequality embeds itself in physical space. Unlike abstract economic data, architecture is tangible. One can measure rooms, walk distances, see separations, feel imbalance. These spatial lessons resonate in ways statistics cannot. They show how wealth organizes not only resources, but relationships. Who moves where, who sees whom, who remains visible, who disappears. The servant staircases are not incidental. They are ideological. They encode invisibility. They normalize absence. They train occupants to accept comfort without contact. That logic persists beyond the mansion. Modern systems often function the same way, though less visibly. Labor remains hidden. Infrastructure remains unnoticed. Comfort remains detached from cost. The mansion simply made this arrangement explicit. This explicitness is why these houses feel so revealing. They show what modern systems work hard to obscure. As society debates inequality, power concentration, and wealth distribution, Gilded Age mansions offer historical grounding. They demonstrate what happens when wealth consolidates faster than social norms can adapt. They show how architecture becomes a tool of justification rather than shelter. They also show limits. No matter how large the house, No matter how refined the materials, no structure can stabilize a social order that no longer supports it. The mansions fell out of use not because they were poorly built, but because the world they served ceased to exist. This impermanence challenges the idea that wealth naturally perpetuates itself. The Gilded Age elite believed they were building dynasties. In reality, most were building monuments to a moment. The difference matters. Dynasties require flexibility. Monuments resist change. When circumstances shift, monuments crack. The houses that survived did so only by surrendering their original role. They became museums, parks, hotels, and educational spaces. They ceased to function as instruments of private power. This surrender is their redemption. By opening to the public, these mansions relinquished exclusivity. They allowed critique. They permitted reinterpretation. They became shared memory rather than private assertion. That transformation is not guaranteed to last. Preservation depends on relevance. If these houses become mere attractions, their interpretive power weakens. If they become aesthetic commodities, their historical value erodes. The task, then, is ongoing. Each generation must decide what these structures mean, whether they are warnings, lessons, curiosities, or inspirations, whether they are symbols of achievement or cautionary tales. They cannot speak for themselves. They require framing. What they offer, in return, is rare honesty. They show ambition without apology. They show inequality without disguise. They show belief in permanence without irony. They are records of confidence untempered by doubt. In a world that increasingly favors ambiguity, that clarity is unsettling. Perhaps that is why the Gilded Age continues to fascinate. Not because it represents a lost golden age, but because it reveals what happens when wealth believes itself invincible. The mansions are not relics of innocence. They are artifacts of certainty. Certainty that power could be built into stone. Certainty that visibility ensured legitimacy. Certainty that scale equaled permanence. History dismantled each assumption. What remains are the buildings still standing, still impressive, still demanding attention not because they succeeded, but because they failed in a way worth studying. They are not answers. They are questions carved into walls. Questions about what societies choose to celebrate, about what they allow to endure, about how power wishes to be remembered, and about whether the future will recognize its own monuments when they finally fall silent.